Anatolia has been home to many powerful empires throughout history. One such one was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were a major regional and world power for nearly 600 years, lasting from 1293 all the way until 1921. But with the end of the First World War, all of that changed. The Ottoman Empire was officially abolished, and the rump state of Turkey was all that remained of an empire that had been so prevalent and long-reaching centuries prior. The area was left rife with instability, economic problems plagued the region, and social tensions were high. After the mid-1920s, the new nation of Turkey was largely forgotten by most of the world, merely existing as any other nation would. That is, until World War II. World War II saw a revitalized Germany knock out her neighbors in a quick strike, removing the main continental contender France in 6 weeks, what the Germany 30 years ago couldn't manage in 4 years. This, combined with the Italians entering the war, caused a panic for the British and the remnants of the French Empire. With most of Europe under Axis control, the Middle East seemed like the next target for attack. However, this attack never occurred. To do this, Germany would have to either invade or convince Turkey to join the war on their side. This didn't happen, and so the Middle East largely was spared attack. But for the sake of alternate history, let's look at what would happen if Turkey joined the Axis powers. But first, we need some history. After the end of the First World War, the power dynamic in the Middle East changed drastically. For centuries, the main and most dominant power in the region was the Ottoman Empire. This empire at its height had control of most of the Middle East, North Africa, the Balkans, and a large section of southeastern Europe. But by the start of the First World War, the once mighty empire had been reduced to its Middle Eastern possessions, being labeled as the sick man of Europe. But by the end of the Great War, the empire was heavily partitioned between the victorious powers. Britain and France divided up the Middle East, while Greece and the newly independent Caucasus nations attempted to split Anatolia between themselves. Dissolution of the Ottomans, birth of the nation of Turkey, and a war of independence soon followed, which will be covered in a future episode. After this, the rump Turkish nation implemented massive reforms to westernize and to rebuild the crumbling economy that nearly 2 decades of war had caused. When World War II started, Turkey seemed to be far away from the main conflict, but within little more than a year, they were at the border of a very successful German Reich. In that time, Germany and her allies had occupied Poland, Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, France, the Balkans, and much of southeastern Europe. Now, Turkey effectively acted as a buffer between the Germans in Europe and the British in the Middle East. Both sides attempted to get Turkey to join the war on their side, but the nation stayed strictly neutral until the end of the war was nearing, when no harm and political reality set in. So let's look at what would happen if Turkey joined the Axis powers. For this, 2 things would need to happen. First, Turkey would need a different president than they had in our timeline. İsmet İnönü, who assumed the presidency in 1938, was not only pro-Allied, but he and many others in the government understood that the nation had very little to gain and much to lose in this war. With Inönü out along with some others and replaced by an absolute idiot, Germany would also need to give enough incentive for Turkey to join their side. In our timeline, they offered bits of Greece as well as the island of Cyprus, but this wouldn't be anywhere near enough to offset the material they gained from being neutral. Likely, demands of military aid, manufactured goods, food, and land claimed by the Italians, with other things, something that Germany simply couldn't supply. When this was demanded by Franco and Spain, the negotiations went nowhere. But let's say that Turkey joins the war anyway. What does this mean? Well, this would immediately open up a front in the Middle East, and depending on the timing of the entry, could mean a significant change in how the fighting in Jordan and Syria would play out. The British preemptively invaded the region to prevent Germany from being able to use the base to assist the North African campaign. If this invasion still happens in our timeline, and Turkey joins the war shortly after the start of the invasion, it could cause significant problems. Turkish troops could march into the northern part of Syria, where the main invasion was taking place, and either hold off the British, or possibly even damage them so heavily that they would need to pull out, allowing the Vichy French forces in the region to be supplied and reinforced. If they time it right, they could also make the revolt in Iraq work as well. The Germans badly needed Turkey to be able to move supplies into Syria, which of course didn't happen. But with Turkey and possibly Syria as a base, supplies could be brought in to build up Middle Eastern operations. Making the Iraqi revolt stick would be a disaster for the British, and might even persuade Iran to be a lot more strident in their pro-Axis leanings. Getting Iraq as an ally, plus perhaps even Syria/Lebanon acting as an ongoing front, would be extremely helpful to Rommel in North Africa, but would require more German divisions through Turkey, which might well be a major problem for Barbarossa. However, 2 German panzer divisions that had operated in the Balkans were not allocated for Barbarossa, and they lost their equipment and redeployed to Italy. Instead, they could be used for Middle Eastern operations based out of Turkey to complement Rommel's Africa Corps efforts. While the region is largely poor tank country with a small line of supply, the 2 panzer divisions in the Middle East could very well be a major problem for the British, potentially a fatal one if met with an Arab revolt in Palestine and perhaps Iran asserting the pro-Axis stance. Iran is in a large part untouchable to the British if Iraq is an open revolt or free of British troops. If the Germans play their cards right, Turkey could then lead to a total unravel of the Middle Eastern for the British and possibly the fall of Egypt. Later, Turkey could be a critical base for operations against the USSR in the Caucasus, but in 1941, if Barbarossa is going to happen, it will be a very important transit point for shipping and warships. In our timeline, Turkey did not allow warships through the Straits, which would have been extremely helpful against the Soviets' Black Sea Fleet. In our timeline, the Soviet Black Fleet was a major player during the early sieges in Barbarossa. It could also allow the Black Sea to be under Axis control, with Italian and German ships being able to come into the Black Sea, unlike in our timeline. This, combined with the Romanian and Turkish navy, could possibly defeat or at the very least, hold out the Soviet fleet from major operations, preventing the vital aid the fleet gave to important sieges of Odessa in 1941, where they evacuated over 200,000, and the siege of Sevastopol, which tied up the German army grew south for many months and bled it very heavily. So what does this mean as the war as a whole? Well, this would almost certainly mean a major fight over the Middle East and likely the Axis in control of North Africa. As to whether or not the Middle East would be under complete Axis control is uncertain. Iraq and Iran may very well come under loose Axis control, but the British possessions in present-day Yemen and Oman would not be open Axis attack. The logistic line, supplies, and overall manpower just wasn't there. The big target was the Soviet Union, so the least amount of resources to achieve results would be diverted to this front. Would the British leave the war at this point? Unlikely. The Axis were spread desperately thin, and this was in reality the furthest that they could possibly hold with the infrastructure and men that was available. So long as an invasion of the Soviet Union occurs, it is near impossible for the British to be knocked out of the war due to territorial conquest. Everything south of Egypt is safe from invasion. India is far too large to conquer, and India plus the other Commonwealth nations also can supply a massive amount of troops for the British. It would be a dark time, but it wouldn't be a dark age. In regards to the invasion of the Soviet Union, if the operations in the Middle East delay Barbarossa, then the likelihood of success in the invasion only diminishes. But why is this? The answer to that is because of Stalin. One of the largest factors that made Barbarossa so successful in the first few months was that the defensive lines that Soviet troops were put forward to in 1940 were not finished by the time of the invasion, and the previous Stalin line had been demolished to build up these defenses. This, combined with his admitted refusal to believe that the Germans had invaded for days, meant that many of the forward units were just pushed further and further back, captured, or killed. If Turkey joins the Axis and fighting takes place in the Middle East, Stalin will notice this and adjust what needs to be adjusted to meet it head on. Also, the more time would allow the Soviet officer class to be fully replenished, and the army to finish its reorganization program. When Barbarossa started, it was only partially completed, so the army was stuck in the middle of a transition with only half of its officers and 2 partial defense lines. An invasion from the Middle East is possible, but the lack of infrastructure in the region would make such a thing rather difficult, especially if the area had had an increase in defenses due to the fighting going on in the region south of the Soviet border. The Soviet oil fields in Baku could be open to German bombardment, but later analysis has suggested that the damage to the fields wouldn't be devastating, as accurate bombing of the area would be difficult to accomplish. In 1940, France and Britain had planned on bombing the oil fields in what was referred to as Operation Pike. Estimates range that the damage done would reduce output by only around 15%, not an amount that would cripple oil production enough to have a major impact on Soviet military capabilities. Staging a massive operation from the Middle East would also likely end in failure. The supply situation would be at its tail end, especially since the main bulk of supplies, support, and replacements would be from the invasion from Europe. That, combined with additional Soviet defenses, terrain, and supply lines, only adds more difficulty to an operation. Will this mean that Germany has less success in Barbarossa? Likely. Does it mean that the war ends quicker? Possibly. The only known fact from this is that the opportunity for Germany to take over the USSR was slim to none. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to watch more alternate history scenarios, click here for the playlist of mine, or if you'd like to learn a little bit more about Turkey during the Second World War, click here for an episode I did about that. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you guys next time.